Please be seated.
Thank you, Your Honour. Dr. Letourneau, you referred in the notes that you provided to the Royal Commission about research having been conducted on offenders' so-called modus operandi, or the strategies that they use. What can you tell us about that?
One thing that I would caution first is that there has been some good research with adults, typically adult men, of course, who have committed sexual offenses against children, to identify how they went about kind of accessing a victim and what strategies did they use, so their modus operandi. What that research often kind of starts with is an assumption that the offense was a very calculated, methodical process. And for at least the initial offense that an adult commits against a child, it may not have been. For some people it will have been, but for some people it may have been a more impulsive, less well thought out, taking advantage of a situation than something that was very, very methodical. So I do want to state that at the outset. That said, this is actually one area where I can discuss a little bit about the institutional behaviors of adults who are in institutions. The Boy Scouts of America serves about 4 million children per year, and Big Brothers Big Sisters serves far fewer, about 200,000 children per year. In the 80s, both of these organizations were really rocked with large lawsuits and deep, deep concern about the sexual abuse of children in their midst and the failure of particularly Boy Scouts to prevent those behaviors from happening and to adequately intervene when they did happen. And the Boy Scouts and Big Brothers Big Sisters independently did a review of their own internal records that they kept. They were keeping internal records on people suspected of or known to have offended against children. And they found that very often there was a real marked set of strategies to really sexualize a relationship with a child, to gain a child's trust, to gain the trust of the child's parents. And so some of the more common strategies that adult offenders used was to give children extra attention, to give children gifts. These will not surprise anyone. These, I think, are very well known. To befriend the parents. Jerry Sandusky is a fairly famous case in the United States, someone who molested and abused dozens, probably more, boys, and he would really befriend the parents, give them tickets to football games, let them attend special events, as a way of really gaining access to these kids. So that's one very common strategy. Another is to use non-sexual physical contact as sort of breaking the ice towards physical contact. So piggyback rides was something that came up a lot. And again, these cases were in the 80s. Tickling, giving massage. So encouraging boys, in particular, Boy Scouts, of course, is a boy-serving organization primarily, encouraging boys to swim naked. And then further sexualizing the relationship by doing things like getting dressed together, maybe showering together, but without there being overt sexual abuse, exposing a child to alcohol or pornography. These are things that not only can sexualize a relationship, but can begin to implicate the victim, so that the victim may feel some responsibility because now they're breaking the rules and they know that that's breaking the rules, particularly with alcohol. I'm not at all saying that a victim is at all complicit in their abuse, but this is one way of convincing a child that he or she is, and it increases or decreases the likelihood that they will disclose, because then the offender can say, well, I'm going to tell on you if you tell on me, and get you in trouble. Another strategy is to isolate a child from his or her friends. And even his or her family to gain a greater psychological hold on the child. And then there certainly are cases of threatening to harm a child, threatening to harm a child's siblings, parents, pets. as a more overt way, and then using physical force and physical violence to demonstrate that, you know, not only are you threatening, but here's a taste of it in case you feel like, in case you start to resist. So those are many of the things that came up from their review of their own records and that have gone into their development of prevention strategies. And so massage, tickling, swimming naked, these are no longer things that can happen. Other strategies, of course, include no longer permitting an adult to be alone with a child. The Boy Scouts have a very clear too deep policy, which is there must always be two adults present for any adult-child interactions. No co-sleeping in tents, these kinds of things.
Have you had anything to do with the Girl Guides?
I have not.
No. Now, you say harming pets. Is that something that's occurred that is threats of that sort?
Absolutely. And kids are very connected to their pets, and so threatening pets can be as effective sometimes as threatening a sibling.
And some of this material has been gathered from looking at the notes kept by the Scouts as to allegations against their members.
Yes, there's an excellent book called Scouts Honors that was published by a journalist who gained access to these files through legal cases, and he pieced together a lot of this information that I'm quoting to you now.
Thank you. Now, is there anything that, Ms. Prattley, you wish to say about strategies in relation to adult offenders?
Yes, I mean, I think a great deal of my experience has been working with intrafamilial child sexual abuse, so with parents or carers who've sexually abused a child or children in their care. And certainly a lot of the things that Dr. Letourneau is mentioning are very consistent with the statements that have been made to me in terms of my clinical experience. I think that another issue that comes with that testing of those physical boundaries is that it makes it harder for children to then disclose, or to resist, sorry. If they attempt to resist that contact, then the adult has an opportunity to say, oh, it's just massage. It's not that big a deal. You know, everybody does this. So denying that intent, that can then make it harder for a child to speak up again. So I think that's really an important feature. And certainly with the threats around moving on, I think one of the things that we also saw, that I've seen in my clinical practice, is a person that's saying, well, you know, if you won't let me, I'll, you know, your sister or your brother. So threatening to move on to another child. I think we can see that in institutional settings as well.
Thank you. Dr. Watson?
No, nothing to add.
Dr. Cutter-Joe?
I think in cases with where an individual might have preferential attraction to a child in a sexual way, they might choose a profession where they might have greater access to children. So that in itself is a tactic, increasing their situational factors, but nothing further to add.
Your Honour, Commissioners, I note that there will be a session tomorrow on grooming and entrapment. So I have no further questions.
That last remark by you, Dr. Cutter-Joe, that therefore implies that screening is far more important in caregiving professions than in others. Is that right?
Yes.
Anyone else?
Just one point of clarification. Ms. Cutter-Joe, you indicated in your relation to your research that the vast majority of males that were offended against as children never went on to have any charges in relation to sexual offences. And you said the vast majority. Your research, I think, showed about 95% of those that were abused as children never have a recorded conviction in relation to a sexual matter. Is that right?
95% of males don't go on to receiving a charge of a sexual offence.
What's the current best understanding in relation to those that are charged with sex offences as an adult sex offenders generally? What's our best understanding of the percentage of those people who ultimately are charged who were abused as children? So if we're talking about the adult population who...
So there's cross-sectional studies that look retrospectively, so they look at sex offender populations and look backwards in terms of how many experience sexual abuse in their childhood is fairly high. About 70% is what's indicated. But when you compare them to other offenders, there's very little difference. So sexual abuse in general and trauma in general is related to offending in general. So there's no indication that there is a unique contribution for sexual abuse in childhood being associated specifically to sex offending, because it's associated with general offending.
So just to be clear, you're saying that about 70% of those that are charged with sex offending are likely to have been abused as children. That's what the indication. But you're saying that that is similar to adult offenders generally.
Well, there's a high rate of sexual abuse in the histories of offenders in general.
May I interject a little bit? I quite agree. There is research that shows that for adults who have sexually offended, those who were abused, there's not a direct link to their childhood abuse to their offending. There is a direct link for adolescents. There is absolutely a direct link. Not all adolescent youth who have engaged in harmful behavior have been sexually or physically assaulted, but there is when we look at the research, we talk about there's a significant relationship there. For adults, there's not a direct link between their own abuse and their offending, except for those adults who went on to develop deviant fantasies. And so when physical or sexual abuse is associated with the subsequent development of deviant sexual fantasies, then we do see an indirect link. So there is a relationship for those individuals who were abused, whether it was sexual or physical, as they're both equally harmful, if then it's also associated with the subsequent development of deviant or atypical fantasies.
And I just wanted to add that where it becomes relevant in terms of clinical practice is an extra layer of complication. So working with adults who've experienced abuse, whether it's sexual, physical abuse, but particularly thinking about adults who've experienced sexual abuse in childhood and who have gone on to make a choice to sexually abuse themselves as an adult, it adds an extra layer of shame and an extra layer of complication in treating those people, because they're struggling to make sense of their own experiences that the majority of times they recognise as having been harmful. Sometimes they don't, and this is what Dr. Letourneau is talking about in terms of that development of deviant sexual interests. Most of the time they recognise that was harmful and then have to go through a process of coming to terms with the fact that they have similarly harmed another child or children. So it adds another layer of complication.
It's related to that. It's been said to us sometimes that physical violence in childhood is more likely to be causally connected with or a significant contributing factor to sexual abusing as an adult. And I was just wondering whether that is your view or not.
I don't know about research. I certainly know for research with adolescents that is the case. I don't know of any research for adults, but from my clinical experience, I can say that the majority of people, of adults that I have worked with, have experienced some form of abuse or neglect throughout their life.
It's difficult to, if I may add, it's difficult to tease apart the polyvictimisation effects. That it often co-occurs, physical abuse with sexual abuse, so it would be difficult to tease apart.
So is it a better way to frame it that the majority, up to 70% of adult offenders, both sex offenders and general offending, is linked to some form of childhood trauma, some form of maltreatment, whether it is physical violence or sexual abuse? Would that be a correct way of expressing it?
Yes, it could even be higher if we're talking about abuse in general.
And is that sort of proposition, would that be the same in the United States and Canada?
Yes, yeah. Most of the research does come out of Canada and America, so.
But there's no reason to believe that Australia would be different from those two jurisdictions?
Well, Australia's like those countries, so no.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a question about the children or youth who engage in the sexually harmful behaviours. Clearly, what we've heard repeatedly now is that these children and youth do have histories of trauma. Is there any understanding as to whether that trauma had been disclosed prior to them coming into treatment, or is the trauma mostly disclosed when they come into a treatment program or get picked up for the offences?
It's generally when they've been charged with something. So when they've been already in contact, because predominantly the kids we see are already through the youth justice sector anyway, so there's been some sort of involvement, so that's where it's generally come up. There are other cases where it comes up in, a young person's been referred for emotional behavioural difficulties, then it does come up in the therapy, and then the due processes are followed then about mandatory notification and police notification.
So are we missing somewhere for these kids to have been able to safely disclose earlier in their life and hopefully have received some sort of therapeutic treatment that would have protected them or helped them to sort of not go down that pathway of offending? I guess that's what I'm really looking at.
Some of the research on trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, which I mentioned earlier, is the most well-validated intervention to address the sequela of child sexual abuse, suggests that it also reduces the likelihood that children will engage in inappropriate sexual behaviors. And so that hasn't been studied as well as I would like, but there's at least one study that did evaluate subsequent inappropriate, not necessarily illegal or even harmful, but inappropriate sexual behaviors, and it declined with the trauma in the group that received the trauma-focused CBT. I think a big message of this is that to the extent that you can effectively prevent child sexual abuse, you effectively prevent more child sexual abuse.
Following that line of questioning on disclosure, understanding an abuse history would be absolutely central to effective intervention or treatment or healing. Our experience, and bear in mind people self-present to us, so it may not be completely representative, but our experience is that disclosure of child sexual abuse is so shameful that disclosure occurs for women, roughly speaking, on average early 40s, and men late 40s, which means the trauma history of child sexual abuse will never be disclosed to many of the counsellors, psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, lawyers and others interacting with these people. To what extent, in your own experience, is that a barrier to effective treatment and intervention? I mean, a real barrier, a significant impediment.
If we don't know, we can't treat, and it's a general statement, but I'll clarify that. And I'll talk from, I guess, from my perspective and the way that I work. If someone's referred to a government health, child and adolescent mental health service, and maybe for emotional behavioural problems, and in the course of work, of an interview, we are all skilled in trauma-informed care and asking those very tricky questions. And if it comes out, then if the disclosure comes out, then we manage it appropriately. But if it doesn't come out and kids have still got ongoing emotional and behavioural issues, you'll continue to work with that young person, again, for trying to facilitate a safe space where that disclosure may or may not come out. The thing about disclosure, yeah, it's incredibly shameful. And that's a lot for a young person to ask of a young person to ask of anyone, but it can also be very empowering as well. And I guess what I'm getting at really is just making sure that we can support people when they are in those therapeutic environments, and those things may actually come out.
Dr. Watson, you said, or you used a phrase which struck me as really captured the essence of many things, and you said that behaviour is communication.
Yep.
Is it safe in your professional field to assume that certain kinds of behaviour automatically signal certain kinds of abuse?
It raises flags. It doesn't mean there's a direct correlation, though. I think that's the thing. It's just because we see a kid with sexualised behaviour, we don't automatically assume that they've been abused. I think we've just got to be very clear that when someone behaves in a certain way, it certainly raises our index of suspicion about what might be going on, but it's not going to necessarily say that definitely happened. But if you've got a young kid with concerning behaviours, now whether that be being defiant or oppositional or sexualised, or whatever, that's a flag of something going on. I think that's where you have to be mindful of, okay, where do I need to go clinically with this next?
Ms Prattley, you have anything to add?
I do. I think that with the issue around delayed disclosures, one of the things that we often see with adults who make a disclosure of childhood sexual abuse is that they may have attempted to make a disclosure earlier, and that disclosure has not been believed or has not been supported, or there hasn't been an appropriate response. So part of what we need to be looking at, and I think this Royal Commission is going some way towards that, is increasing awareness and increasing the ability of people working with vulnerable populations and working with children generally to be able to respond appropriately to children's disclosures, because children do not come out and say, so-and-so is sexually abusing me. They make those disclosures in other ways. People need to be trained to respond, to recognise and respond appropriately. The other issue is around this idea of working with, addressing trauma in children and young people. And I think that when we're looking at an out-of-home care system, we need to be working from the assumption that any child coming into that system is presenting with a level of trauma, and they need treatment around that. It's not enough to put children in group homes with changing staff, with varying degrees of qualifications. It's not an environment where children are going to be able to repair their trauma, even if you're sending them off to counselling once a week. They don't have a sense of physical and emotional safety to be able to address the issues that are going on for them. We need to be doing something better around that.
May I say something about disclosure? At least in the United States, there was David Finkelhor, who was here yesterday and will be back again tomorrow, I believe, conducted a study that identified to whom children are most likely to disclose, and it's teachers. It's not mental health professionals. And so I think to add on to what my colleagues are saying is I think teachers are well aware that child sexual abuse happens, but I think many of them and pediatricians and people in professions that see kids generally need more tools in terms of how to address disclosures when they occur, how to effectively address those. Law enforcement and mental health are the last to know often, and so empowering and educating educators and pediatricians in particular should be a goal around how to handle disclosures.
Just one matter, Your Honour. Commissioner Fitzgerald asked Dr Katajar a question about her research and referred to convictions. I think your research was in relation to people who were charged.
Charged, that's right.
Just to clarify that. Now, Your Honour, in terms of this panel, we say goodbye to Dr Letourneau and Ms Prattley.
Well, thank you both. You, Dr Letourneau, for your work yesterday and today. These issues, of course, are fundamental to the future of children in this country and indeed in your country as well. Mm-hmm. And they need to be considered carefully by the Commission. So we thank you for your contributions. You're both excused, but I'm afraid the other two have to come back. Thank you. 10 o'clock in the morning?
2 o'clock this afternoon.
2 o'clock this afternoon? Oh, that was a good shot, wasn't it? Okay, well, adjourned till 2.